While your head tube is folded down and we have the crossbar and the joint 1 clamps sitting in front of us, we're going to go ahead and take these outer clamp caps off so we can put the lower strider pole in there. There's 4 screws. There are 4mm screws for this particular setup. So I took out 3 of the long screws. Here's the 4th one to come up. Now I have this ready to put the strider pole in here and put the clamp back on. First thing I'll do though, or before I do that, I'll take the one out on this side and then we'll unfold this. Okay, so I took the cap off of both sides. Alright, cap's down here and the 4 screws that hold it. The upper strider poles are sitting here and they're attached by cables to the head tube. I'm going to rest this one up here like this, and now I'm going to lift this head tube up and we're going to set it up and clamp it. And in the meantime, I'm going to put these up here just so the cables will match. Right? Now, when you lift the head tube up, you've got a couple of devices up here that are involved in this quick release system. There's a pin that sits here, and that has actually a spring-loaded component to it, so it pushes a pin out on this side. That pin is going to fit into this hole that you can see right there, but in order to get this all the way up, I've got to move it to the right, lift it up, let it slide back in, and then bring the quick release part up onto this little shelf right here. Let's see if we'll go up there, yep, and then fold this down. And this actually requires some force to do that. It's closed now and it's open this way. If it's not tight enough when you fold it down, what you do is you tighten up this little 10mm nut right here onto that shaft, and it brings this a little bit tighter so it works. Right now it's set properly, but if you needed to, you can adjust your clamp in that position. I'm going to fold this down like that. Alright, now we've got the head tube up. We're ready at this point to put the lower strider pole in here and connect the crank arms back to the bottom bracket back here. So we're going to bring those assembly over and set them in position so we can insert them onto the frame. Here's the right side strider, ski underneath, foot platform, lower strider pole, and the right crank arm with the chain ring on it. This is going to fit onto that bottom bracket spindle right there, and this piece is going to fit up here where we just took the cap off of this joint 1 clamp. Okay, as we're setting up to put our lower strider pole into the joint 1 clamp, there's a few things to point out. One is there's a set screw on the base part of the clamp, and we're going to rotate that so that's on the bottom. And you'll notice that there's 4 screws, set screws, into this crossbar. These set screws actually reduce the play between the bushings and the bushing housing to make sure that this is a nice smooth motion, but these are not to be over tightened. You just tighten those up to make this nice and snug, but it freely rotates. It's not like it's stuck there. All right, once you set that right with those 4 set screws, and they can be loosened or tightened with a 3mm wrench right here, and that'll make a nice smooth motion. Then we're going to go ahead and put the lower strider pole in there and put the cap on it. So we're going to lift this up, we're going to set that in there, we're going to put the cap on of the clamp, and we're going to set this in there so that it's even distance on this side of the cap and on this side of the cap, between the base of the clamp and the cap of the clamp. And then we'll put 4 screws in, and we don't have to tighten these now, we're just going to put them in to hold the strider pole here while we do the other part, which is the bottom bracket and the right crank arms. We're going to put those in a little bit, just screw in a few threads to hold it there, and then we'll eventually insert the upper strider pole and set it for the height and position of the size of the rider. Next thing is to insert your right crank arm with the chain ring over top of that bottom bracket spindle. You'll notice this is a square spindle, and the mating side on this crank arm is also square. That's going to insert onto this. We'll put a crank bolt in to hold that. This should have grease on it when it arrives. If it doesn't, put a little bit of grease on there. We're going to insert this like this. Make sure that it slides on. And then in your little packet of parts, we take one of these crank bolts, the 8mm wrench, and screw that on. And this now we can screw on tightly. It's easiest to put the crank arms on when they're hanging down in the 6 o'clock position. And we'll tighten this down. All right. Now that we have the lower strider pole set up in the clamp's not tight, but we have the crank arm on the right side, that's inserted onto the bottom bracket, and that is tight. Now we're going to take the right strider pole, and the right strider pole is the one that has the brake and the shifter on it. And we're going to leave the padding on this right now because we don't need to slide it all the way down. And we're going to insert it into this right strider ski down to around where the stop line is. And these stop lines can be either in black or they can be in white. It depends upon the colored decals that were used at the time. And we're just going to let that sit there for a while until we get everything else set up. Then we'll set it to be the height of the rider and tighten up this particular joint 1 clamp. So I took my 3mm wrench, this is the left side now, and I adjusted these little set screws to give me just a nice smooth motion but no play on there. I'm going to rotate this around so that the set screw is on the bottom on this side. And now I'm going to lift up the left strider pole, the lower one. I'm going to set it in that groove. Add the outer cap of the joint 1 and then put some screws in here to hold it just loosely. And I'll turn them a couple times with my 4mm wrench just to make sure it all stays there. Okay, now we're ready to put on the left crank arm. Now we're going to put the left crank arm on the bottom bracket, but keep in mind the left crank arm and the right crank arm have to be 180 degrees apart. So we're going to leave this one in the 6 o'clock position on the left side, but we're going to rotate the right side around to make it 12 o'clock and then insert this onto that bottom bracket spindle. Take your 8mm crank bolt and screw it on and tighten it up. Now with the left side lower strider pole and crank arm attached, I'm going to lift up the left strider pole and I'm going to insert it into the left lower pole and let it sit there with the padding on it until we get ready to set it for the height we want. What we can do right now is to go ahead and rotate your crank arms around and make sure that everything is smooth. It's a nice smooth rotation. Now we can set the strider poles and tighten the outer clamp. These strider poles have gradations on those and decals. It can be white decals or black decals. And there might even be some grease on there that's used when they're adjusting this and setting it up when they first assemble in the factory before they put it in the box. In fact, that process of building these things, making sure all the parts fit, and then putting it in a box may result in a couple little scratches around here where hard parts were screwed against the paint. But in any event, they don't affect any aspect of the performance. Now, I'm going to set this at the 3rd line down. There's a 4th and then a stop. This is for somebody about 6 foot tall. This can run from about 5 foot tall people down to 7 foot tall people if you lift it up all the way. And this is about in the middle at about 6 foot. I'm going to rotate this around so my strider pole is pretty much on a front plane or a flat plane with the sideways view of this strider, and then I'm going to tighten up these screws, these 4mm screws. Now it's very important when you tighten these screws up that you tighten them up in a nice X pattern like this so that these two parts squeeze together evenly and you have the same amount of gap on this side as on this side between the cap and the base. So we would start screwing this in and go in a few turns on that one, then go down here, tighten this one up a few turns, then go over here and tighten this one up a few turns, and keep going back and forth this way to make sure that this cap is tightened against the base absolutely evenly. Strider pole is tight, these are tight. You got the same distance between the outer cap and the base on this side as you do on this side over here. It comes out to be about 4 or 5 millimeters. All right, strider poles all attached. We'll go ahead and do the same thing on the left side. Now with both poles adjusted to the right height and both joint 1 clamps secured, we can go ahead and tighten up the brake levers and put them into position. I rotated the brake lever so it's in front of the grip, and then right here is a 5mm clamping screw that clamps the brake and I put a 5mm wrench in there, and I just tighten that, and that secures this brake lever. I did the same thing on this side to tighten up this brake lever into position. It won't move. And then I use a 3mm wrench to tighten up the shifter cable. Now the shifter cable should be on the outside of the brake cable. And then tighten that up, and now the shifter won't move. And I can rotate the shifter. Last thing I want to do is to put these cables into position, so I'm going to use a zip tie. It comes in the pack. I'm going to put a zip tie around these cables on this side. And I like to do it just above the first bend in the cable here. One on this side. That secures the cables into a nice position so they stay there. And then clip off the ends of the cable ties with a pair of scissors. All right, so all your control system is set. Poles are adjusted to the right height for a 6 foot tall person. You just have a few more things to do.